Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
We are in the midst of a global pandemic. Today we explore measures for how, potentially, we might address help another one. Inactivity has been described as a pandemic due to the health impacts of people not being active, and therefore needs to be addressed. Rachel Aldred, Professor of Transport at the University of Westminster and Director of the Active Travel Academy, joins us today to unpick how we might solve this with increasing cycling levels. This is an important time to discuss this, given thoughts about what transport world might emerge out of COVID-19. So in the 1950s, 1 in 4 people cycled. Today it is less than 5%, that's 1 in 20 people. So Rachel, why have levels fallen so dramatically since the 1950s?
Yeah, and it really was a dramatic fall. I mean, one of the things that surprised me when I first got into this area a long time ago, I guess I'd assumed that there'd been some gradual decline in cycling levels, and it really isn't like that. Cycling levels fell off a cliff in the 50s and 60s, and it was part of what was happening there was just a massive shift towards the car. That at the start, immediately after World War II, driving was really a minority activity. Most households wouldn't have had a car. Maybe it was like 1 car for every 20 people, something like that. But, the whole assumption in transport planning and policy was that the car was the future. And we planned for that very effectively. Roads got busier and busier. Walking and cycling became less and less attractive. And cycling levels fell in a 20-year period from cycling being normal to cycling being completely weird. It happened very, very quickly in a generation.
And you were interviewed on the Reasons to be Cheerful podcast last year, a podcast co-hosted by Ed Miliband. And in that, you were asked at the end of the interview, if you were appointed a cycling czar in government, what you would do on your first day. And in your reply, you said you would be speaking to Treasury and funding was key. And you'd ask for about £2 billion worth of funding. And given that the government has now announced £2 billion funding for walking and cycling through their cycling and walking investment strategy, are you encouraged now where you think the direction of cycling will go?
The devil's in the detail. So I was talking about 2 billion in a year. So this is 2 billion over, I believe, 5 years. So it's not really quite the same. We're not achieving that level of ambition yet. Obviously, it's good to see funding announced. It's good to see, in particular, the emergency funding package, because, it's really important that in the current context that we reallocate road space and we make space for safe walking and cycling, given physical distancing, given people's fears about public transport and so on. So it's good to see that, but we're not really, it's still a long way from being mainstreamed, and it's still a long way from being the level of funding that we need. And it's, and it's not just money, of course, as well. It's political will, it's around tools, technologies, techniques and methods and so on. And there are still a lot of barriers in terms of our traditional tools and models for transport planning and so on, and it really needs a sort of step change in ambition. I quite like the guidance on the emergency fund that was used around local authorities had to reimagine the streets, and they had to move away from the status quo, which I think is a great ambition. But think about the situation that local authorities are in. They're really struggling. They were struggling before, and now they're struggling with a whole range of challenges. Many of them really need not just financial support but also technical support to do some of this stuff. So there are a lot of challenges, and I think more money and more support is needed.
And you mentioned the emergency funding there. One of the things is, are authorities doing the right thing? Do they know what works and what doesn't work? And obviously, as a nod, I think, to a country with very high cycling levels, the Mini Hollands has been something that you've looked at for what Walthamstow Forest has put in place. And you'd looked at sort of what this active travel intervention with a cycling focus in a suburban context had achieved within the first year. So what were the findings from your research from that?
Well, this was a really interesting study to be able to lead. So probably worth explaining, I guess, what the Mini Hollands programme is. So the Mini Hollands programme is around £100 million of investment allocated by Transport for London to 3 London boroughs. So that's Waltham Forest, Kingston and Enfield. And the programme started back in sort of 2015, 2016. And when I heard about this programme, I was really excited about it because it wasn't in Camden or Hackney. It was in outer London. So it was in a context that's maybe more typical of metropolitan areas within the UK. This is often quite a car dependent context. It's not a context in which you generally have lots of cycling. Kingston has a bit more, but Waltham Forest was about average for London, and Enfield lower than the average for London. So generally, fairly challenging context. And the proposal was to really put in place a step change in terms of walking and cycling environments. And so my study was a survey funded by Transport for London, a survey looking at outer Londoners, and it was longitudinal, so it's been following the same people up year on year. And the nice thing about that is you can distinguish changes that are due to the weather, for instance, from changes that are due to infrastructure interventions, because you've got a comparison group of people who live in the rest of outer London. So the first year, we started in 2016, and the first year findings, so that's 2017, was looking at changes in travel behaviour, changes in attitudes to the local environment. And I wasn't necessarily expecting to find anything by that point, because it had only been a year. But the really exciting thing was that we did find a measurable change in travel behaviour. So that's been repeated actually the 2 following years. So it's a consistent finding of people getting like 40 to 45 minutes a week more walking or cycling, which is associated actually with a pretty big health economic benefit, because a lot of people most of us are not as active as we need to be. So there's a measurable increase in active travel. But the additionally exciting thing was it wasn't just an increase in the mini Holland boroughs. It wasn't just being in Enfield or being in Kingston or being in Waltham Forest. It was actually associated with living near interventions. And specifically in the first year, these were what are more widely being called at the moment low traffic neighbourhoods. So this is where, and this is a problem in a lot of London actually, that you've got other urban areas, you've got sort of motor traffic cutting through residential areas, and you've got often, they're meant to be quiet streets and they're small streets, but they're very, very busy with motor traffic. So low traffic neighbourhoods are trying to take that motor traffic out of the neighbourhood so that you can still drive to your front door if you need to, you can still get deliveries, but people from outside the area can't just cut through your residential street. So that was largely the kind of thing that had gone in at year one, and largely, as you mentioned, Justin, in Walthamstow in the south of the borough of Waltham Forest. So those were the things that we could see having an early impact. And most of that increase as well was walking. So this was initially, it was seen as the cycling scheme, as you indicated, and funded under the cycling budget, and then it kind of expanded a bit to be walking and cycling. But actually, these measures seem to be having a particularly strong impact on walking, although there is also an increase in cycling. So really, it seems like, I mean, maybe it's not rocket science. If you take lots of motor traffic out of people's neighbourhoods, they are more likely to walk around. They generally feel a bit safer. They feel like it's a more pleasant, comfortable place to walk. So that was really interesting to find that. We saw also that people had an improved perception of the local environment, which I'd maybe expected to find change first, but actually the behaviour changed as early as well, as early as the attitudes changed. And really, after a year, we were seeing the difference.
It's interesting that it covered both walking and cycling. Obviously, there's a target for government to increase that for children getting to school. So a nod to another country in this is obviously schools, when they reopen in September, the use of public transport will be reduced. So there is a risk of increased car use for getting pupils to school. So one of the plans is to try and increase the levels of cycling. So the largest city in Denmark, Odense, sees about 63% of children cycling to school. So I was wondering how the propensity to cycling toolkit that you've developed could help planners support moves to ensure that children in this country, children in the UK, cycle to school instead of maybe getting in a car that they might do otherwise.
Yeah, and that's a kind of really exciting new feature that we've been able to include in the Propensity to Cycle tool. So the Propensity to Cycle tool, or PCT, is a tool that's been funded by DfT, led by University Consortium, Cambridge, Leeds, Westminster, LSHTM, and it's the aim is to really highlight at both area and route level the scale of the cycling potential that exists. You know, the fact that there are lots of short trips that are currently very often driven that could potentially be shifted to cycling if we had the right kind of infrastructure policies and so on. And the nice thing about the PCT as well is that it maps these at route level, so you can see where this cycling potential is in terms of the route network. So to start off with, we only did cycling to work, and we used the census data. Now, a tool like the PCT, you need spatially detailed origin destination data, because you're trying to map these potentially cyclable trips to the route network. So the census has that. The census has origins and destinations in terms of people's home location, people's work location. So we're able to do that for commuter cycling. But of course, commuting is only like 19% of trips. So most of our trips are not commuting to work. And we were very aware that the PCT, just doing commuting, it was only covering a minority of trips. And obviously only certain people commute, working age adults, basically. Children don't commute to work. Older people are less likely to commute to work. So we really want to do other trip types. But the trouble is, there isn't often the data available to do that because we don't, the census is just travel to work. But there is another data set, an analogous data set that we were able to use for travel to school. Now, up until 2010-11, the Department for Education used to collect, as part of their annual school census, data on pupil travel to school. So basically, and you would have obviously the safeguarded data, you'd have the pupil postcode and you would have the school address. So, using that data set, we were able to do similar things with travel to school than we earlier did around travel to work. So we built the PCT schools layer. Now, this is all available at pct.bike. It's free and open source. People can use it. It's not just aimed at a select few. And travel to school, the really interesting thing about travel to school, and maybe it's obvious when you think about it, but travel to school, the route network looks different from travel to work. So when you do travel to work, for instance, particularly somewhere like London, but big cities generally, travel to work, it's like there's a central pull. Basically, routes tend to go into the centre. But when you do the map of travel to school, of course, you don't have all the schools in the centre. But what that means is that you need to, if you're thinking about planning for trips to school, you need to think about destinations in neighbourhoods. You need to think not just about everybody going on those radial routes into the city centre, but you need to think about creating, really good quality routes, because school children need really good quality bike infrastructure to those schools in all those neighbourhoods across the city. And they're kind of complementary networks. They highlight, the commuting highlights the radial network, and the schools highlights more orbital and neighbourhood networks. So for us, that was really important to add that and to sort of think, well, actually, we're being quite biased if we're just planning for commuting, and often, like the London cycle superhighways, you look at that is a radial network that's taking you into central London. And those routes are really important, but they're not really so helpful necessarily for getting to school. And if you think about commuters, quite a few commuters, particularly women, they're not just going into work. They might be dropping off kids. They might be picking up kids from school on the way back. So we need to think about the school. If we want to plan an equitable way, we need to think about these other journey purposes. And the potential for cycling to school is immense. So one of our scenarios is called Go Dutch. And, I know the Danes do well as well, but the Dutch are also doing well at cycling to school. So we have this scenario called Go Dutch, where for travel to work or travel to school, we look at cycling potential as in being, okay, so what if commuters here or school children here were as likely to cycle to work or to cycle to school as the Dutch, based on the distance and hilliness of those trips? So, it doesn't assume that England is flat. It basically looks at the characteristics of the trips that we have now. And the Dutch, for instance, are very likely to cycle 2 miles, but they're pretty unlikely to cycle 8 miles. So it's based on those kind of propensities by distance. And the interesting thing is that for commuting at the moment in this country, 3% cycle to work. And under the Go Dutch scenario, it will be like 19, 20 or 20%. So obviously a big jump. But for travel to school, at the moment, 2% of kids cycle to school. But under the Go Dutch scenario, it's over 40%. So the gap, we're underperforming horribly in terms of cycling potential for commuting, but it's much worse for cycling to school. And I think there's a range of factors there, but one of them is that we don't plan for school trips in the way that we should do, but also that school children need particularly good infrastructure. So one of my studies looked at the kind of infrastructure that people wanted to be able to cycle with kids. And you'll get cyclists who, they'll be prepared to put up with a bus lane or a painted cycle lane. It's not very good, but they can cope with it. But there's no way they're going to be cycling there with their 5-year-olds. So we need a higher standard of infrastructure. And yeah, it's important to plan for all those diverse trip purposes.
It's interesting you mentioned equitable outcomes, because it's seen traditionally as a sort of the term mammals used, isn't it? Middle-aged men in lycra, and there's this perception of cycling being a sort of certain cohort. So widening that uptake of cycling, particularly for more women cycling, more children cycling, it does require a change. One of the things, I feel like you've been representing active travel throughout COVID, and you've been on the BBC News and stood alongside sort of somewhat empty roads at that point in London, and and also undertaken some research looking at as lockdown eases, people start travelling back again, that the numbers of people, the sort of growth in car use could be quite significant. So these are various scenarios that might emerge out of COVID, I guess. So what was the research on that, and what was your forecast on that?
Well, this was looking just in a quite broad brush way, looking at data from the 2011 census data, which is obviously getting a little bit out of date now, but that is the most recent census data we have. Hopefully before too long we'll have the 2021 census. But looking at that 2011 census data in terms of the types of trips that people are making and what might happen if those trips to work, again using the travel to work data, were shifted to car, but then conversely what might be the scope to shift them to walking and cycling. And so in terms of trips potentially being shifted to car, I found potentially there was there might be up to 1 million more commuter cars on the roads so this was the scenario basically, that public transport commuters who have access to a car, started using their car because they're nervous of using public transport, or they're not able to use public transport because of the capacity restrictions that are in place, but they have to go back to work. So that was the kind of worst case, sort of short medium term worst case. And obviously there are a whole range of constraints. I mean, people can't just drive into central London because it's very difficult to park, but you can see the pressure there. You can see the pressure across a whole load of our metropolitan areas that people currently or pre-COVID travelling by public transport, and the fact that a lot of those do have access to a car in their household. So it's a kind of twofold issue as well, because people without a car, do they have a choice? Do they have other options if they're not able to use, or they don't feel able to use public transport? But also those people who do have a car, if they don't feel they've got options, then understandably they may try and jump in their cars. And it's, if there's not a good option for them, it's hard to say that they shouldn't be doing that. So it becomes additionally important that we have good active travel facilities as well as public transport that's safe for people to use. So the other side of it was we looked at the trips that were being made currently by public transport and the length of those trips, and it was quite interesting because when you split them into trips made by bus and trips made by train, they have quite different characteristics. And again, maybe this is not that surprising, but it's useful to look at it, that the bus trips tend to be relatively short, and 3/4 of those are potentially cyclable distance, which I was defining as up to 10 kilometres, which obviously not all those trips will be cycled, but that kind of length, particularly with an e-bike, quite a few people might consider cycling it. And some of the shorter bus trips as well possibly could be walked. There are some quite short bus trips, so around 75% of bus trips are potentially in the region of being cyclable. But for train trips, it's lower than half. So train trips tend to be longer distance. But the flip side of that, from a sort of COVID and post-COVID planning perspective, is that a lot of the jobs that people do who travel by train are probably easier to do by home working, I think. So if you look at the occupations, there's a lot more sort of office-based occupations of the type that you can do working from home. And that's people who commute by train, that's not everyone, but that's quite a few of those jobs. Whereas people who commute by bus tend to be more likely to be doing the kind of jobs where you are, you're more likely to need to be in there in person. So those results were sort of suggesting that in terms of shift to active travel, we should focus particularly on the bus commuters and to think about how could we enable active travel corridors, like perhaps the one they're building down the Euston Road at the moment, that could potentially take up some of those. If you've got buses at the moment, I'm seeing buses in London that are nowhere near as full as they used to be, and they have signs up saying full because the capacity level has been reached. So that potentially if you can build those active travel corridors to take some of the heat off public transport, you could really help those bus commuters who otherwise, some of them, they're going to be waiting a long time to get on a bus, or some of them are going to be trying to use their cars, understandably, if they have access to cars, because if they don't feel they have another option, if they don't feel the bus is safe or available, if they don't feel they've got a safe cycle route. So it's really important to have those active travel corridors so that we can leave the space on the bus for the people who really need it, for the people who can't use active travel and who can't drive. The train people, some of those trips could potentially be shifted to active travel, particularly perhaps with the help of e-bikes. But perhaps for those people, it's also more important to think about, maintaining home working. And this is a slight aside for this podcast, but I don't really see why people should be told to go back to work if they can potentially, carry on home working perfectly safely and effectively. And I think for some of those people who would be commuting by train, some of those longer distances, it would be a good idea to think about how some level of home working could be maintained if they are not going to feel like, if they're not going to be able to use public transport or feel safe on public transport.
And you mentioned safety a number of times there. The figure of 62% of adults has been cited. This is 62% of adults aged 18 plus in England agree with the statement, "It is too dangerous for me to cycle on the roads." And am I right in saying you've suggested that there needs to be a reconsidering of the term vulnerable road users? Could you expand on that for me?
There's probably a couple of things worth saying. I mean, firstly, that some of the research that I've done on near misses has shown, why, given some insight into why people feel this nervousness that people are experiencing. People who cycle regularly in the UK are experiencing, say, a very scary incident on around a weekly basis. So our roads do feel hostile, our roads do feel off-putting. And if you think about, whether parents would like their children to be on the road in that kind of environment, well, very often, no, this is not the kind of environment that people want to experience. So there is a real experience of this kind of unpleasantness, of lack of safety and so on. But I think one of the, as you alluded to, one of the things that maybe helps here as well is reframing vulnerability. So we talk about vulnerable road users, and by this we tend to mean people walking, cycling. Sometimes motorcyclists, horse riders and so on are also mentioned, but certainly in terms of walking and cycling, and I expect horse riding as well, these are modes that pose relatively little risk to other people. They are, the reason they're seen as vulnerable is because people are at relatively high risk of being injured. But perhaps we should turn that around, is because if you're walking, walking is a safe mode. Walking is safe for the walker, and it's relatively safe for other people as well. So really, should we turn the focus on the cause of danger in the environment? The cause of danger to people walking is primarily people driving motor vehicles. So a paper that I've co-authored and also a project that I'm working on is seeking to quantify that. And there's some quite good metrics produced by DFT. We have some quite good road safety data here, and DFT produces metrics of, say, if you're a walker, if you're a cyclist, if you're in a car, how likely are you to be injured per kilometre walked, cycled or driven? And I want to turn that around and sort of look at metrics of, okay, so you're cycling a mile, or you're driving a mile in a car, or you're driving a mile in an HGV. How likely are you to injure somebody else? And that sort of turns it around. And that, because if you look at driving an HGV in terms of the risk to the HGV driver, it's super safe. In a sense, we should all be going around in HGVs because, we'd all be really safe. But the risk posed to other people outside the HGV is incredibly high. So, it's about turning that around and about trying to include the true cost of transport modes as well, because, the way that we traditionally calculate it and traditionally, operationalize road safety, the worry is that, one takeaway would be, well, stop anyone walking and cycling, because of the injury risk. But actually, there's been some quite interesting modelling studies that suggest that if you have a big enough shift from the car to walking and cycling, then actually you get a drop in injuries, because although people walking and cycling are more vulnerable, if you get a big drop in the amount of cars on the road, then there's a lot less vehicles that are causing the injury. So you actually get a benefit. So yeah, I think it's important to turn it around and think about danger and measure danger, not just measure vulnerability.
And obviously in those quieter streets, cycling helps, but on busier roads we're likely to segregate the cycling infrastructure. At least that's probably a good thing. But even that segregated cycle lanes is something that you've like to reconsider possibly. You think that might require a sort of rewording, if you like, to explain it a bit more clearly?
I think it's always worth thinking about sort of the language and imagery that we use, because sometimes the kind of impressions that we give or the kind of picture we're painting is not quite what we intend to convey. And there's been some interesting discussions in policy circles about whether to use the term cyclist at all, or whether to say people who cycle and so on, because saying cyclist, as you were saying earlier, Justin, conjures up this image of this mammal and a middle-aged man in lycra zooming along on a road bike or something like that. And maybe if you say people who cycle, that's like, okay, it's a person, it could be a female person, person, it could be a child, it could be, so changing the language. I think around cycle tracks, then I think I've been quite convinced by the arguments that calling them segregated is not a particularly happy term, that it kind of has quite a lot of negative implications, and certainly they don't use that term in North America. So if we're sort of talking to them about bike infrastructure, that's not a term that they would like us to use. But yeah, it has those negative political connotations, and I think it doesn't really highlight the benefits in a sense. So I think protected cycle tracks is a nice way to put it, because it highlights the fact that you are protecting people cycling from the source of danger, which is predominantly motor vehicles. Separated would be okay as well, I think, because it highlights that we're not just talking about a line of paint on a road, we're talking about, at the least something like armadillos or planters or something like that. So yeah, terminology, and we're learning all the time.
Yeah, no apologies. I think people who cycle is more appropriate than the term cyclist.
It's longer though, isn't it?
Just on that, the question of bad drivers or bad people that cycle, or bad cyclists, if you like, you've done some work in that area through the People and Places qualitative research. Can you explain what the findings were, particularly, I guess, on some of the language about what bad meant in that context, but also the implications arising from the research?
Yeah, no, this was really interesting because I've done quite a bit of more quantitative research recently, but my background is qualitative research. I'm always really interested in how we talk about things and yeah, the implications of that. So I had this survey data from the People and Places survey, which was a survey that where I looked at the Mini Hollands programme. And one of the things in this survey, we had quite a few comments fields so that people could leave a comment about their local area or travel in their local area. And as you can imagine, people have quite a lot of views on their local area and travel in their local area. So we got thousands of comments. And so I thought it'd be quite interesting to analyse these comments and look for a range of different things. And one of the things that I looked for was around talk about driving versus talk about cycling, because cycling and driving are both kind of controversial a bit in the data. And there is quite a lot of complaint and awareness of bad behaviour by both people who drive and people who cycle. So fine. So I thought, let's have a look at how this is phrased. Let's have a look at the kind of things that people talk about. Now, there were more complaints, significantly more complaints about people who drive, but there's still quite a bit of, talk about bad cyclists, if you like. And it was talk about bad cyclists. And that's part of the interesting aspect of it, because when people talked about bad behaviour by cyclists, it was very much about cyclists. So you would get complaints, cyclists ride on the pavement, cyclists do this, cyclists do that. And it was kind of quite out-groupy, and that there's this group of people, and quite often there would be a follow-on. And I think there was one quote I cited in my paper where it was something like, cyclists ride on the pavement, they are the most dangerous group of road user. So sometimes there was an explicit generalization to the fact that all cyclists generally being bad, but even where there wasn't, it was like there was an identification of a group of cyclists doing a bad thing. But when I looked at complaints about driving, it was very different, and obviously there was a lot of awareness of the negative impacts of cars and driving, but people tended not to talk about drivers. They tended to talk about cars, which is really interesting. So they would say things like cars park on the pavement and cars speed. So it's like the car is doing something, not the driver. And when there was a person mentioned, it was in a much friendlier format than the cyclist. So it would be, for instance, commuters park on the pavement here or something like that. So bad driving was talked about both in a more depersonalizing way. So it was like the car was doing these things, not the individual, but also in a friendlier way that, sometimes it was where there was a person, they were a commuter or a parent doing something. Whereas when it was cyclists doing things, it was almost always cyclists. It wasn't, commuters ride on the pavement. It was cyclists ride on the pavement. And I think this is quite interesting because it chimes with some of the language. There's been analyses of how we talk about traffic collisions, and this passive voice for talking about driver behaviour has been identified as basically absolving drivers of blame, because we talk about cars doing this, we talk about accidents, we have this whole language that really puts the emphasis again. It kind of goes back to link to that why we should talk about danger as well as vulnerability. It sort of takes the attention away from the source of danger. It's the car. You've seen it in newspaper reports, like a child was in a collision with a car, and it's very much it's very passive, and it's very much like the car was just there. Something just happened, and so it very much fits into that kind of thing. And on the other flip side, the focus on bad cyclists fits into this kind of stigmatization of people who cycle, which I've identified in research for some time now. And it's really, sociologically, it's really interesting, because it's almost like there are these negative stereotypes of people who cycle, and they're all contradictory, but they're all problematic. So I published a paper that was called Incompetent or Too Competent, and it was all about how people who cycle attempted to create a persona as a good cyclist, but it was really hard, because on the one hand they were trying not to be a mammal, a lycra lout. They didn't want to, it was being too competent. They didn't want to be too much of a cyclist, having all the gear, having the right bike. That was seen as a real negative stereotype. But on the other hand, they didn't want to fall into the stereotype of being the person who is seen as like bumbling along on a basket with a skirt and probably being incompetent. This is more feminized stereotype, and any kind of stereotype of people who cycle was really difficult and problematic, and this whole kind of outgrouping. So it's the implications for policy are quite interesting, because whenever things are cast as a cycling scheme, then this stereotypical image of the cyclist is never very far away. And I think Transport for London have sort of learned this lesson a little bit. If you look at how Transport for London represent people who cycle in schemes, you go back a few years, then they would have used this stock image of a guy on his bike leaning forward, looking like your typical cyclist. And they, often that guy would just be peppered throughout drawings, and it would be like, oh wow, there's going to be loads of those guys. And now they use a much more diverse. They've got like often even somebody with a kid, someone on a hand cycle, and they're trying to show much more of a diverse range. And that's just a sort of hint to say, look, this is something that could be for everyone.
It feels like the language even of cycling and walking and active travels maybe changed as a result of COVID-19, given all the images that have been put out of people able to walk and cycle more. And it's interesting seeing where this goes and what might change. There might be a shift potentially, but we'll see.
I hope so. Let's see. Fingers crossed. I mean, I'm quite hopeful for at least parts of London and some other places as well. I just worry it's going to be really patchy.
Yeah, because it is a global thing. You've seen moves across various bits of the world that have been pushing this, but it's often the major cities that have been sort of standing out in that regard.
Yes.
But we'll see. Yeah. Well, you mentioned that a lot of your research is actually qualitative, and I enjoyed a recording that we did a couple of years back in 2018, which is if people want to listen back to that, that's available, and that covered injury research, underreporting, inequalities, and safety in numbers. But it's been great to speak with you again today. So thank you very much. That was an interview with Rachel Aldred, Professor of Transport at the University of Westminster and Director of the Active Travel Academy.